So you'll tell me when to start. Yeah, I know, from my career broadcaster.
I know. It's awesome.
Super. Welcome to another of our webinars, Mental Illness and Pastoral Care, and we're grateful that our colleague, Dr. Elizabeth Pierre, is presenting on this important topic. We're especially grateful that she is our colleague not only now, but for years to come, as she's recently accepted a position at North Park University and Theological Seminary, for which we are very pleased. She's a valued colleague with competence and care, very, very impactful on our students. Thank you especially to the Covenant Chaplains Association, who's been very invested in this whole matter, and through their Good Shepherd initiative has helped to fund it. So we offer a special welcome to those who are the Covenant Chaplains Association. And thank you, Elizabeth, for presenting at this time.
Great. Thank you so much again, Tim. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for those who are online. Glad that you're here. We definitely want to hear from you with any questions or resources that you might have as well. I want to thank the Good Shepherd Initiative for Luke and Tim as we gather together to think about what we wanted to do this year for our webinars. Again, thank you to the online community. Thank you for the tech folks, video folks, Evan, Joshua, and Heather to make sure that everything goes smoothly. So, for our webinar today, we're going to be talking about mental illness and pastoral care. So, quick story. On Saturday, it was a gorgeous day, and I thought, I don't want to stay home and work on this, so I'm going to go down to one of my favorite restaurants, hangout place downtown called Italy. So I went there, and I had all my stuff sprawled out, and it was crowded, lots of people. It's a tourist trap. And 3 women ended up sitting next to me. And they saw what I was doing, and we started having a conversation. And they asked, so what are you doing? I saw your book on anxiety. And I said, I'm doing this webinar next week on mental illness. And suddenly, they all started to share about their experiences. One of the women has a nephew who is bipolar, and shared about the frustration about living, with her adolescent nephew living with this and how hard it's been on the family. He's no longer in school, trying to deal with that. And two of the teachers, one of the middle school teachers told me that that her 2 middle school kids committed suicide in her school. And they were ages 10, maybe 11. Middle school, actually maybe in their early teens. One was found hung and the other one overdosed on opioids. So as I sat there and we had this discussion, a very rich discussion, I thought, wow, God, you're really highlighting how real mental illness is. And if I had stayed there longer, I wonder how many people would have approached me as everything was laid out on anxiety and on depression, how many more stories I would have heard from people around me. All that to say, this topic is important, one that our church needs to engage in. And here's some goals for our time together, that this is a beginning conversation. The prayer and the hope is that we'll have subsequent conversations on mental health, looking specifically at issues, mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, or any others that you might want someone to talk about, myself or my other colleagues. So feel free to online community to let me know. Also, this webinar is just to provide some fundamentals about mental illness. There's a lot of myths out there about mental illness, so just want to bring some clarity to what that might be. And create space for further conversation. Again, this is a beginning. We only have like an hour, actually less than that, because I really want to hear from you, especially on the online community. And I won't be lecturing the entire time or presenting the entire time. Finally, to give some resources for you who are in need of resources as pastors, ministers, family members, partners, etc. and to know that you're not alone. Over and over in my own research and talking to even the women at Italy on Saturday, there's this feeling that I'm the only one who deals with this. I'm the only person who has a family member. I'm the only one struggling with this particular illness. And as we'll look at the statistics, you're not alone. 40 million people in the United States, that's just the United States, have some kind of diagnosable mental illness. Okay, so a question. What, this is for you, those online too, what first comes to mind when you hear mental illness? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Crazy.
Crazy, quote unquote. Anyone coming up?
My
Your uncle. Okay.
first time that I was introduced to the concept of mental illness, maybe 6.
Mm-hmm. Your uncle. Your uncle. Okay.
Awkwardness.
Awkwardness. Okay. Anyone online?
Memories.
Okay. All right. So we'll keep coming back to this because people, again, awkwardness, crazy, uncle, family members are all of the things that people. Oh, there's one.
There's a delay.
Oh, there's a delay.
The online people are just seeing it now.
They're still seeing it. Okay. So we'll wait for a little bit.
They just switched to us.
Okay. So for those of you online, what first comes to mind when you hear mental illness? Nothing? If anything comes up, just let me know. We'll move on. So let me give you some statistics and we'll address what mental illness is later. But we're going to stay here at least 5 minutes on the statistics. I really want people to know, our churches to know, our communities to know how prevalent mental illness is. Approximately 1 in 5 adults in the U.S. and 43 million or 18.5 experiences mental illness in a given year. 1 in 5 adults. Approximately 1 in 25 adults in the U.S., 9.8 million or 4.0% experience a serious mental illness in a given year that substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. Approximately 1 in 4 youth, and this is especially for those who are in youth ministry and college ministry, age 13 to 18 experiences a severe mental disorder at some point during their life. For children age 8 through 15, the estimate is 13%. And these statistics are coming from the National Alliance of Mental Illness. It's online, and these studies have happened between 2015 and 2017, roughly. 1 in point adults in the U.S. live with schizophrenia, and there's a higher rate of schizophrenia among the African American population. It's unclear as to why. 2.6% of adults in the U.S. live with bipolar disorder, and 6.9% of adults in the United States, 16 million, had at least one major depressive episode in the past year. 16 million. 18.1% of adults in the U.S. experienced an anxiety disorder, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and specific phobias. Higher rates of PTSD and alcoholism are among American Indian population. And there's some racial and cultural issues around that as well. Among 20.2 million adults in the U.S. who experience a substance abuse disorder, 50.5 to 10.2 million adults had a co-occurring mental illness. Usually the term that you hear is comorbidity. So if someone is depressed, sometimes the way they try to cope is through drinking. Or if they've had an experience of trauma, they use drugs. So then you now have not only the actual event, but now the alcohol is introduced. African Americans and Latino Americans use mental health services at about 1/2 the rate of Caucasian Americans in the past year, and Asian Americans at about 1/3 the rate. And then as we think about the churches, we need to be mindful of that. Many of these communities are not going to mental health clinicians. They're coming to the church. They're coming to pastors to help them, or any other kind of clergy person. Mood disorders include major depression, dismissive disorder, bipolar disorder are the third most common cause of hospitalization in the U.S. for both young and adults aged 18 to 44. The third most common cause of hospitalization. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S., the third leading cause of death for people aged 10 to 24, and the second leading cause of death for people aged 15 to 24. And each day, an estimated 18 to 22 veterans die by suicide. So again, I have a heart for kids, especially for ministers, teachers, Bible study leaders in your church. Half of all chronic mental illnesses begin by age 14. 3/4 by the age of 24. And so a lot of these mental illnesses, depression, ADHD, they start to emerge in adolescence. And the most prevalent are major depression, general anxiety disorder, and substance abuse. Over 1/3, 37% of students with a mental health condition age 14 to 21 and older who are served by special education dropout, the highest dropout rate for any disability group. And the women that I met in Italy, that's what happened to her nephew. He dropped out of school because of his bipolar disorder. And when I was working at an institution back on the East Coast, so prevalent. Depression, anxiety were one of the many reasons that either students killed themselves or ended up dropping out of school. And more than 90% of children, and again, those two teachers that I talked about earlier in our time, 2 of their middle school kids committed suicide. And here, more than 90% of children who die by suicide have a mental health condition. And both of those students that that teacher mentioned had a mental health condition. So, I took time for these statistics to really show, again, it's impossible to feel, you could feel that you're alone, but to know that you're not alone, especially when 1 in 5 men and women have been affected by mental illness in some way. So why does this matter to the church? It's one of the reasons why I'm here. They asked me to do this. Here's one story. This woman, Amy Simpson, she actually wrote a book called Troubled Minds. It's one of the resources that I have towards the end. And she and her family have experienced mental illness. She says, one of the greatest catalysts to our pain was the sense that we were alone. I believe the church was as confused as we were, and the people in our church were responding the best way they knew how. But the silence wasn't healthy for us or for them. And when the church is silent to a person in crisis, it can sound remarkably like the silence from God. Any thoughts about this? Thanks, Deborah. And online folks, feel free to jump in whenever you want.
We have a mental health ministry.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
As part of our church. But I don't think they have enough airtime, if you will. I wonder if some of these things are best addressed on Sunday during the preached word. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people aren't familiar or don't even know we have this ministry.
Right.
Unless it's mentioned on Sunday, and you still miss half the people or the new people that come. So,
right.
Yeah, this is important to the church.
Right. Thank you, Deborah. You're right, and we're going to be talking about that. Anything online, Mary?
Just somebody saying they like the quote.
They like the quote. Okay. Anything, Tim or Mike? Okay. All right. Feel free to jump in anytime. A recent survey happened by Lifeway research group said that family members, 65%, and those with mental illness, 59%, want their church, Deborah, to talk openly about mental illness. So the topic will not be a taboo. But 66% of pastors speak to the church once a year or less on the subject. So here you're a congregation, again, looking at all the statistics, you know either people in the congregation, in the youth group, the pastor, him or herself, have a mental illness, and no one is engaging it. and people are feeling that they are alone, and consequently they feel that they're left alone with this in their own faith. Okay? And you can get that online. So what is mental illness? I'm not going to get too clinical here, except for this one little piece here. But again, enough information for church communities, other forms of communities to start engaging this and to think about it differently. But here's this one clinical. I can't really see it, but I'll read it. So the DSM-5 says, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Diagnosis, is manual. It's for clinicians to use to make diagnosis for people. Says that a mental illness is an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying the mental functioning. Okay. I get that, but at the end of the day, I think the DSM-4 folks are still trying to navigate that themselves. These are all aspects of a mental illness, but they're realizing more and more there's so many layers to what a mental illness is. First of all, it's complex. So you have the emotional, you have the psychological, you have the biological, and developmental, where there might be a possible dysfunction. But how and when and what buffers it, there's a spectrum of it. So it's complex. At one point, researchers wanted to say, okay, mental illness is a brain disease. But there's a danger in that when you just want to simply say, oh, this is a brain disease. They call it a benign stigma. That's what they actually call it. But what ends up happening is that it makes people feel like that's their only narrative, that I just have this, and that's all who I am. So it's disempowering and it's dehumanizing. There are some brain issues, neurological issues that contribute to mental illness, but that's not the only reason why people have mental illness. So it's important to know that there's not just one story that makes someone have a mental illness. Sometimes it's a brain injury. Lately with the CTE with football players, something happens to the brain, or an accident can trigger some type of mental illness. Can be hereditary. For some disorders, there might be some hereditary links involved. If there's depression that runs in the family, most likely, but not necessarily all the time, a person in that family may have also that condition. Impact on the body. I think it's very important, especially with something like depression, where your body just literally starts shutting down. There are people who are depressed that they cannot leave their home. They cannot function. Everything in their body cannot respond to any kind of activity. So it also affects the body in a way that can actually then trigger the emotional feeling about being depressed. Like, I can't move, I'm tired, and the cycle continues. Trauma, and that's my particular area of research. Interpersonal violence, such as psychological violence, emotional, sexual, domestic violence, can trigger and contribute to depression, can contribute to anxiety, can contribute to PTSD, can contribute to alcoholism. Veterans, we think about our veterans who've experienced war. That's where trauma really, really came to light, is after the veterans returned from war and they're realizing that, oh my goodness, they couldn't function, or they would commit suicide because they witnessed such violence in their experience abroad. If anything you remember today, a little bit from this webinar, is that there is a danger of a single narrative. To not say all depressed people feel this way, or all anxious people feel this way. It varies based on genetics, it's based on one's resilience, it's based on culture and support system. It looks different for everyone. And so for us to say, or to claim, or to abide by these myths saying, oh, this is what depressed people are, this is what bipolar people are like, is a disservice, and really contributes this feeling of folks feeling dehumanized. Like, I am just this quote unquote illness. And that is not just a part of their story. Like, we all have different parts of our story. Yes. Mary, thank you.
This is helpful. We have a comment from one of our online participants, Randy Roberg, who's sharing that he's a chaplain in a fresh meats pork plant, which is interesting, Randy. Our our management has worked with a program called I Got Your Back, and I think it's improved the actions of people who want to help. So it's interesting to hear of chaplains in secular industry.
Oh, thank you, Randy. That's so important. Thanks for that feedback. So the struggle. Here, what most in the research, I've worked as a therapist. This is what I often hear working with people with mental illness, is the stigma. Like something is wrong with me. There is a characterological or ethical deficiency that's viewed as contagious. So they don't want to engage. Like I don't have it unless they talk to me in that one room. So there's a stigma around having a particular mental illness. The dehumanization. There's a great book called Resurrecting Persons by John Swinton, where he talks a lot about how people with mental illness are treated as non-persons. Again, they're just viewed just as the mental illness. Like you're depressed, but not Andy or Sue or whomever who may be having this particular mental illness. They just peg that person with that mental illness. And isolation. So if you're feeling stigmatized, if you're feeling dehumanized, what's most likely to happen is that you end up isolating yourself. No one understands me. I'm the only person who is depressed. I'm the only person who can't get out of bed. My spouse is the only person who can't get out of bed. My children are the only ones with ADHD. And you just end up becoming in your inner world, and you suffer alone. There's this great article that I read about these two women, Gina Gallagher and Patricia Kanjoian, I think is how they pronounce her name. Two sisters who have children with emotional disorders. And they're saying that how oftentimes that they called the article, "Shut Up About Your Perfect Kid." You know? That every parent thinks, it's I'm the only one with this particular child who has a depression or a bipolar or whatever else condition that they might have. And what they're realizing, no, that they're not alone. That's why they wrote this book. And the thing is, when I think about scripture, Psalm 139, it says we're fearfully, wonderfully made. It doesn't say that we're perfectly made. We have to remember that. And so we all are a bunch of beautiful cells and things that God has created us to be, but we are also living in a very fallen world that contribute to our own unhealth and non-health. So again, I don't think they want people not to say the great things that their kids are doing, but we can live, especially on the playground. Everyone talks about how perfect their kids are, and it keeps other people from understanding that not every kid, quote unquote, has this perfect life. Yes, Tim.
When the holiday season comes, sometimes you get a Christmas letter from a family member, a relative, a friend that chronicles how outstanding their children are and how accomplished everyone in the family is. And if you're a little blue anyway, for some reason or another, that could be the final straw that breaks the back.
Right. But again, thank you, Tim. And again, if the statistics are true, and I believe they are, the numbers often don't lie, that's not necessarily true. Again, doesn't mean that's not, there's not valid. Again, you want to brag about your family, but it's not necessarily the reality. Sort of like Facebook, it's an alternate reality, alternate facts. That's not the reality of what's going on. We really are not alone. And the church at least should be the place where people can bring the good stuff, but also saying, you know what? I'm struggling with my kid. I'm struggling. And so what support is here for us? So why the church is so critical? Individuals with mental illness turn to clergy primarily. Not to me, not to Mike, who's also a clinical psychologist. They turn to clergy. And here are why. They're unable to access mental health. And for some of the populations, Latino, African American populations, Asian populations, for various reasons, they don't have those services in their community. There's stigma associated with mental health services. I always talk about me. I'm Haitian American. My family still doesn't necessarily understand why I do what I do. Like, why would people pay you to listen to their stories? It's like you don't talk to people who are not your family. So, but it's safe to talk to a pastor. You get to be talking about to the pastor about anything. Cultural beliefs about mental illness. There's a lot of quote unquote, you said earlier, Mary, about being crazy, or people are not able to function at all. And at times that's true, but again, that's only a soul narrative, or something, maybe they didn't pray right to God, or maybe they're not really a Christian if they have these issues. So they want to talk to their pastor to help them figure that out. It's free and affordable. I don't think pastors are paying. I mean, they get paid, but not by that person who is seeking their help. And similar worldview. A lot of people want to go to someone who understands them, who understand God, who understand their faith. Here's one important quote as well. So, why the church is critical is that folks turn to the clergy. And second, it's the gift of community. Really love this quote by this woman named Nancy Green McCrae. She talks about her own depression. She says, sometimes you literally cannot make it on your own, and you need to borrow from the faith of those around you. Sometimes I cannot even recite the creed unless I am doing it in the context of worship, along with the body of Christ. Now, you could say that this is a fault of memory, and maybe it is in part, but I think it goes further than that. When reciting the creed, I borrow from the recitation of others. Companionship in the Lord is powerful. So it's already there. The church, you have your pastor who's there for you, and you have this community where you are encouraged and supported, even when you don't feel it yourself. The presence of others, this companionship is critical as part of the healing as well. And then we have the gift of ritual. They're ready-made rituals. We have the preaching. In some churches, you have genuflections. You have the holy water. You have prayer time. All these are actually important. You know, the literature says that's important to help someone who is struggling with any type of mental illness. It's providing a cognitive schema to help interpret their experiences. It's a way of coping physically and emotionally and psychologically when there's nowhere else possibly to turn. The church is there for that, but we're not actually using and accessing it as a community. So here's some things just to kind of think about for ourselves. I love this quote here by his name is Pastor Abraham, and he shared about his own experience with someone in his church who had schizophrenia and how difficult and challenging that was, but he really felt God was calling their church to engage this woman named Tammy. He says, the church has the opportunity to humanize the people with mental illness through genuine, intentional friendship. However, such friendship is not for the weak of heart. Friendship requires courage. And in this friendship entails empathy, even if you may not have an experience of a mental illness, but to try to wonder what might that be like or imagine for someone who does, and engaging that. And remember, isolation is one of the things that many people feel with the mental illness. And so to say, you know what, yes, this is what's going on with you, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And I honestly, having journeyed with people as a friend, as a family member, and also as a therapist, it does require courage because you learn so much about yourself too. And you realize that depending on where we are, we fall along the spectrum. Some people may be diagnosed, but even engaging with someone with mental illness requires the sense of recognizing our own frailty as well. There's things for us to learn, and it's mutual. It's not something we just can do for them, but what people with mental illness can share and do for us in this mutual relationship. They're not just other. They're our brother, our sister in Christ. Empathy, that's part, and solidarity. Oftentimes I've had to journey with friends, going to the hospital with them, visiting them in hospitals, to know that, listen, you're not in this alone. The solidarity. It's not, and when people feel that they're not alone, that's so integral, more and over in the research too. Social support is key for people to journey. Medication is great, their counseling is great, all of the above is great, but having other people journey with you, however long it takes, is transformative. And then it's partnership, psychoeducation. I know in my church, there were a lot of therapists in our church, so one day we had a workshop. All the therapists got together and basically talked about what therapy is and what it's not. My niece at one time thought, she didn't know what I did as a mental health therapist, and she said, "Do you read minds?" And I said, "No, honey, that's a psychic, not a therapist." But again, that was her, she didn't know what it was. And I think a lot of people have there are these myths about therapy and what it is. Are they going to be brainwashing you? Are they going to try to? No, this is an opportunity to connect. Many clinics, practices are more than happy to come to a church to talk with you. We need them and they need us, because so many people with faith go to them at times to engage their mental illness. Support groups, things like Al-Anon, grief support groups are out there. Put those informations in your narthex at your church. Let people know about them. Talk about them, not just on a specific mental health month or week, but constantly engage it. And what I found recently was this thing called Living Grace Groups. It's a peer group that focuses on mental illness. And it's framed in a way that's helpful for the church, uses that kind of language, and each church can tailor how they want to engage the material. So sort of, they give you some key components, but you tailor it to your church, and it's peer-led. Finally, preaching and the liturgy. Be mindful of the language we use when we talk about mental illness in the church. These myths, I'm going to blow them up or they're going to have them. Okay, I see your face, Deborah. It didn't come out that. But how we talk about people with mental illness, how we engage, and how we shun certain people. If one of the things that you said, Tim, was people who are awkward, or may feel awkward, or who oftentimes that's the social anxiety. So we just don't leave them out on their own. You engage them. You want to listen like anyone else, and you engage their story as well. How we talk about medication. Sometimes I hear that, like, oh, I'm taking my meds, or it's like a comical thing, but it's also hurtful because we would never joke about someone taking insulin. Oh, you're taking your insulin? Like, that's just, no. People take their medication to keep them stable, and there's nothing funny about that. So even talking the way with our language, and then if you think, oh, it's the joke, the people who are on medications, they're not going to tell you because you're minimizing it. So mindful of our language. Yes, Deborah.
So you're working with someone or befriending someone who has a mental illness and they're taking their meds, but someone who has a lot of influence in their life is telling them, you don't need your meds. Keep praying. Talk to God.
Yes.
That's one of the things I'm struggling with.
Okay, so you have someone who, are the person challenging their faith because they're taking medication? Is that what's going on?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a daughter and a father. It's the father that's challenging her. You don't need meds.
Okay.
So, how do
Usually, again, what I would say, again, we'll talk more about this in a few, is that, if you needed something for your heart, if you need something for your blood pressure, you need to take it to keep her stable. Is there fruit in her taking the medication? Mm-hmm. So that's it. Yeah. God can use insulin, Prozac, Lexapro to keep someone to get better. And there's no shame in that.
One other thing,
Yeah.
I think we need to work on changing our language. Like what I hear often is everyone has one of them in your family. And I wonder if we change the language, we all have someone part
Right.
of our family.
Right.
Because if you say one of them in, they can easily be taken out.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great point. Thank you, Deborah. That's a really good point. Yes.
We have two comments from online folks from Mary Hendrickson suggesting that social media also plays a huge role in reinforcing the stigmatization of mental illness. Mm-hmm. Everyone shows the, quote, highlight reel of their lives rather than the struggles. Mm-hmm. And we have a question from Alex of Keith Smith Jr. He says, when it comes to journeying with a person through addressing mental health, do you see unhealthy attachment to the pastor or individuals that are helping as an issue? And if so, how do you suggest addressing that attachment?
Okay. Really great questions. Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Alex. There are several ways to address that particular question, Alex. First is that, and though people say, but I'm the only pastor in my church. I get that too. That's the challenge too for some people who are living in rural communities. But this is where the whole community, so it's not just a pastor, it's the actual entire culture of the church. So it's not the only pastor who believes this, but, it's the entire church community who believes that, listen, we're all in this together. And secondly, is to encourage, again, back to what we're going to talk about soon, is preaching about this, like about mental health clinicians and getting support outside the church. You can still do that on a regular basis, take your medication, but we'll journey with you too. I'm not the only person who can serve as the one journeying with you. Your counselor can journey with you. Your psychiatrist can journey with you. Your support group can journey with you. And that's something for some people it's new language. Even though, quote unquote, the stigma is lessened, there's still this idea that, the pastor is the only one that can only be the only sole person who can understand me. That person is a part of the entire community. And again, if this language, the culture is emphasized throughout, then the pastor should be just one of many people that this person is journeying with. Okay? Alex, you can always ask me again. I know who you are, you know where I am, and I'll find you if you have any more questions. So examples in the Bible. You know what? I always find it so interesting how we sanitize the Bible. I tell my students this all the time. There's so much drama in the Bible. There's adultery, there's suicide, there's family dysfunction, but we never talk or address about these issues. I mean, there are prime examples of people. I was just reading the story of Hannah, and I'm like, okay, it's about infertility. But then I read it again, and I thought she wasn't eating, she was sad, and she was infertile for a long time. So most likely Hannah was depressed. But no, and that's a preaching point there. And women who are infertile or families who cannot have children, often that contributes to depression. And you don't have to make it a mental illness month, but it's just a natural. The people in the Bible are not robots. They're real people, flesh and blood, who had feelings and emotions. So this one psychiatrist writes, mental illness, like any other chronic condition, can feel overwhelming at times. Patients can feel as if their diagnosis defines their life. But that's not how the Bible sees those with mental illness, he said. He pointed out that many biblical characters suffered from emotional struggles, and some, were they alive today, would likely be depressed with or diagnosed with a mental illness. The Bible is filled with people who struggle with suicide, Elijah, or with majority of them were depressed or bipolar. If you take a good look at it, you start seeing these different behaviors. Last week in my class, I asked the students, who in the Bible would they consider depressed? Job was a big one. He lost everything. That makes sense. Another student mentioned the apostles, what was going on with Peter and Paul, if you look at, their behaviors. I mentioned Tamar. She was raped and then she was left, and then no one ever saw her again. She could never be married or have kids. Huge stigma in her life. David, the psalmist, up and down, Saul, and these are preaching points that we can use on a regular basis. The entire sermon doesn't necessarily have to be on mental illness, but what you're showing is that, listen, there are real people in the Bible who've had emotional struggles. Like, if you lost everything, you would be depressed. If you couldn't have children and you wanted children, you might be depressed. If you thought you were going to die, like Elijah thought, and that you would be anxious and you're not sure if you're going to live or die, So using those stories on a regular basis can make it less stigmatizing for people with mental illness.
So how about we throw out a pastor's challenge?
A pastor's challenge? Okay, Deborah.
Pastor's challenge. Every character that they preach on, they have to find the mental illness and talk about that.
All right. Let's see how that goes, especially with those online.
That might include a little bit more research.
Right. But again, it's just talking about it. Like, these are real people with real feelings. Thank you, Deborah. Anton Boysen, and many of those who are chaplain know who Anton Boysen is. He actually created chaplaincy. He himself had a mental illness. It may have been, I think, schizophrenia or maybe manic. I can't quite remember. But he wrote about it. Great book. It's called Out of the Depths. And he writes, the minister of religion is concerned always with the problems relating to mental health. This follows inevitably from his task as a servant of the church. So he was a theologian, a counselor, and as well someone himself who had a mental illness. I think he's right. So here's some thoughts for reflection for you online, for us, for all of us. What do you believe about mental illness that may hinder you from addressing it in your congregation? We all have feelings. I think Mary talked about it online here, saying, our social media, or the media, what it talks about mental illness, what we believe about it, all may possibly hinder how we engage it in our churches. So what do you believe about mental illness? Do you believe it's spiritual? Do you believe it's biological? Do you believe it's psychological? You got to engage that, because that affects how you inevitably engage other people in your community. What is one first step your congregation can take to offer friendship or offer compassion to those in your community? For some of you, reading some books about it, maybe doing a Bible study on it. I'll have a list of resources shortly. I know there's a great book called Bipolar Faith by Monica Coleman. She's actually a theologian at Claremont Theological School and shares her own journey of sexual violence and depression. And it's profound. It's something that you can do as a church community. Or do one of those Living Grace group curriculums or others. There are plenty of them online. What do you need from God to help you and your congregation to address mental illness? Ask God. Really, take some time praying. Ask God. It's in our community. 40 million people, 1 out of 5 people have a mental illness. They're in your family. They're in my family. How do we love and serve our church community? And finally, if you're a pastor and or chaplain, have you addressed your own mental illness? And I specifically want to engage that particular community. I don't understand why. This is my own little beef, with how, pastors are other human beings, but they're so elevated that they can't share their own struggle. And that's a danger, and that could put pastors in a very isolating place, especially with their families, where we don't think about that with doctors or, business people. Family's a family. Family has great health, and family's going to have dysfunction. But pastors are often isolated. Chaplains are often isolated because they present a certain way, and they may be struggling with their own mental illness, or someone in their family, but they feel completely alone. So I would encourage you to address that. I think there's things within the covenant that can support you, or engaging with other pastors in your community and developing something there. Or if you have a family member who has a mental illness, what step might God be asking you to take care of yourself and your family? I think, again, pastors and chaplains, anyone in the religious community, often want to hide when they're the ones, especially they're pouring out so much, they're the ones that need so much support. And to know that you're not alone in this. You had your hand up.
Yes, we have from one of our online participants, Richard Moore, saying that it's so difficult to hear the topic because of the personal connection. I see this in our family, town and country church, community, and I'm here because I need to confirm my struggles and know I'm not alone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What's his name again?
Richard.
Thank you, Richard. You are not alone, Richard. Thank you for letting us know and sharing. And again, like I said earlier, this is a beginning conversation. So what we're really hoping to do in the fall is to look specifically at certain mental illnesses. Number one will probably be depression, because there's that tends to be one that keeps coming up. But online participants, if there's anything particularly that you want us to address, let us know. Either I will or other colleagues will address that and provide care and knowledge around that. So here are some of the resources that I think, beginning resource. Anton Boyes, and I love him, especially for the chaplains. I think you love him too. He writes a book, The Minister as Counselor. But again, I really like the Out of Depths, an autobiographical study of his own mental disorder. Monica Coleman, who's a theologian, Bipolar Faith, a Black woman's journey with depression and faith. Darkness is My Only Companion, Catherine's own journey around depression. Swinton, great book, Resurrecting the Person, talking about not engaging what we talked earlier about mental health not being the only, or mental illness, the sole narrative of a person's life. They are someone with any of us who has a condition that they're navigating life with. Mother Teresa, now we know that she had major depressive disorder, functioned, did so many things in the world. We have those elements of folks in our Bible as well, who had a mental illness, whether you would label that or not, but still were able to function and live. And so again, not to pigeonhole or to peg people with mental illnesses. So resurrecting the person. Amy system, mental illness in the church, and the church's mission. And Living Grace Group, again, a faith-based group that engages mental illness. And National Alliance of Mental Illness, NAMI. Great resource for families and just basic secular knowledge or blogs about showing us that none of us are alone on our journey in mental illness. And that's all I present. Any questions or other thoughts before we wrap up?
We have one affirmation from one of our online participants, Mary Hendrickson, saying that Bipolar Faith is a great read.
Okay, great.
So she's affirming your recommendation of that.
Okay, great.
Of that
Thank
source.
Oh, yes, Mike, please. And Mike DeVries is our director at School Professional Studies in the MA Counseling Program. So thanks, Mike, for being here.
I think one of the important things is the partnership that clergy can develop with a local mental health professional. I think that team approach is really useful in not only supporting the pastor in the work they're doing with their congregants, but also from the therapist point of view, to know that the pastor is supportive and that there may be resources in the local church that can walk alongside families and individuals who are struggling with mental illness.
Absolutely. And Mike, would you see that many, because you have a practice, that most therapists are more than happy to engage with clergy?
Yeah, I think so. And I'm seeing more and more pastors who are willing to engage as well. I've been a therapist for 30-some years, and I remember early in my career I visited a local pastor, and I said, well, I just want you to let you know that we're here as a resource. And he said, well, I'm not aware of anyone in my congregation that has any mental illness issues. So, pastors certainly many of them have been completely out of touch with that whole issue. So, but I have seen a lot of change in that regard.
Okay. Thank you so much. Mary.
We have from Tony Schwabe in Minnesota. Hi, Tony. Saying it's hard to talk about this from the pulpit in a small church, since this is not a subject people do want to admit to the congregation, but may have told me. And some will go right to the personal place that I'm talking about them. Which is a good point.
Yeah, that is great. Good to hear from you, Tony. Yes, that is such a challenge. But again, that does show that, again, we're all affected by mental illness some way. But I think we need to keep persevering, keep taking that challenge. It takes courage to keep talking about, even if it can be uncomfortable at times, because too many people are feeling alone, especially, and again, I want to plug in for children and youth who often feel alone, and to make sure they get the support. I would encourage youth ministers, children groups to just pay attention to the kids in their group, make sure they get the support that they can as well. Since a lot of these mental illnesses start emerging again during adolescence. Anything else? Any other thought? Oh, again, I have one more, not a plug, but because the research on trauma is something that that tends to be my focus. A lot of these people who've experienced trauma, whether it's sexual violence or physical abuse or war, or even what's happened, earthquakes, whatever that is, whatever those particular events are, the shock can be so incredible that it does contribute to all these other kind of particular the comorbidity that I talked about. So people will try to drink alcohol. So we can't make assumptions again about someone who's consuming a lot of alcohol. It's like something's wrong with them, or it's like becomes a moral thing. Oftentimes, not all the time, but in the cases that I've had, they're usually using alcohol to cope with something, And it's important for pastors, clergy folks to take the time to listen to the story. So again, not a single narrative. It's complex, it's multi-layered, especially with people who've experienced trauma. They're trying to deal with it the best way that they know how. But when we have more conversations like these, then we can look at the underlying layers that may be connected to it, possibly. Anything else before?
Oh, you might just want to tell people that it's going to be archived.
Oh, yes. This webinar will be archived. Thank you, Mary. So if you'd like to listen to it or get the slides, they're online. Anything else? If not, Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you. We're fine. Thanks, Deborah. Right.